The silence in the conference room on the 42nd floor of the Hudson Yards Tower wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the specific, suffocating silence of a room where a number on a spreadsheet has just dictated the end of a career. It was 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. Elias Thorne, the managing partner of Aurelius Capital, sat alone at a mahogany table that cost more than the average American family earns in a year. In front of him was a single sheet of paper, the preliminary covenant report from Sterling National Bank. The number that mattered was the debt service coverage ratio. The covenant required it to be 1.25. The number on the page was 0.98. This wasn't just a missed target. In the world of leveraged buyouts, this is what is known as a technical default. It meant the bank now had the legal right to call in the loan. It meant the $400 million of debt Elias had layered onto his portfolio company was no longer a tool for growth. It was a guillotine. He picked up his phone. He didn't call his wife. He didn't call his lawyer. He called his chief financial officer. "Marcus," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of the panic that was currently constricting his chest. "Don't come into the office. Go directly to the bank. Tell them it's a reporting error. Buy me 48 hours. "Elias," the voice on the other end crackled, groggy and fearful. "It's not an error. The cash isn't there." "I didn't ask if it was true," Elias replied, staring at the lights of the city below. "I said buy me 48 hours. He hung up. Elias Thorne had spent 2 decades building a reputation as the smartest man in the room. In 48 hours, he would be known as the man who vaporized $1 billion of pension fund money on a strategy that looked perfect on paper and nowhere else. To understand how Elias Thorne ended up in that room, you have to understand the seduction of the roll-up. In private equity, the roll-up is the holy grail of financial engineering. The logic is elegant, mathematical, and, to a certain type of mind, irresistible. It works like this. You find a fragmented industry, not tech, not energy, something boring, something essential, dentistry, HVAC repair, or, in Elias Thorne's case, veterinary clinics. In 2019, the veterinary industry was 90% independent. It was composed of mom-and-pop clinics run by passionate doctors who loved animals but hated balance sheets. These small clinics were valued at roughly 4 to 5 times their EBITDA, their earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But large consolidated corporations? The market valued them at 12 times EBITDA. Here was the arbitrage. Here was the free money. If Elias could buy 100 small clinics at 4 times, strip out the back-office costs, centralize the purchasing, and rebrand them under one corporate banner, the market would instantly revalue those same earnings at 12 times. He wouldn't just create value. He would manufacture it out of thin air. Elias wasn't a monster. He was a rationalist. He was 42, a Stanford MBA, a former McKinsey consultant who viewed the world as a series of inefficiencies waiting to be corrected. He didn't see dogs and cats. He saw recurring revenue units with high emotional switching costs. He launched Vanguard Pet Health. In early 2020, he raised $200 million in equity from institutional investors, teachers' unions, university endowments, people who trusted him to be boring and profitable. Then he went to the banks. Capital was cheap. Interest rates were near zero. The banks gave him another $400 million in debt. With $600 million in firepower, Elias went hunting. The early days were a blur of victories. Elias's acquisition team swept across the Midwest like a storm. They targeted clinics with aging owners looking for an exit. The pitch was perfect. "We'll buy you out for cash. You keep practicing medicine. We handle the payroll, the HR, and the inventory. You get to be a doctor again. We'll be the business." It worked. In 18 months, Vanguard acquired 140 clinics. On paper, the strategy was performing flawlessly. Revenue skyrocketed. By centralizing the supply chain, Elias negotiated a 20% discount on vaccines and pharmaceuticals. He cut the accounting staff at every local clinic, replacing them with a single software suite managed from New York. The arbitrage was real. Elias had bought these cash flows for $40 million a year. By cutting costs and raising prices slightly, he turned that into $65 million a year. And because the market viewed Vanguard as a platform, that $65 million was valued at nearly $800 million. He had doubled his investors' money in less than 2 years. The industry press called him a visionary. Private Equity International put him on their 40 under 40 list. He began to believe his own narrative. He believed that spreadsheets were a map of the territory. But spreadsheets have a fatal flaw. They don't account for culture. They don't account for morale. And they certainly don't account for the emotional volatility of a veterinarian who has just euthanized 3 dogs before lunch and is now being told by a corporate algorithm to upsell a grieving owner on a premium cremation package. The first warning sign didn't come from a bank. It came from a resignation letter. It was Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the lead veterinarian at a high-volume clinic in Ohio. It was one of Vanguard's crown jewel locations. She didn't just quit. She sent a letter to the entire regional network. "I became a doctor to heal," she wrote. "I did not become a doctor to meet a client average ticket quota. I will not push unnecessary diagnostics just to satisfy a quarterly EBITDA target. Vanguard is not a partner. It is a parasite." Elias read the letter in his office. He dismissed it as noise. "She's emotional," he told Marcus, his CFO. "Replace her. Increase the signing bonus for the new hire if you have to. We're optimizing the model. Friction is inevitable." But the friction wasn't linear. It was exponential. The genius of the roll-up strategy relies on synergies, the idea that bigger is cheaper. But in a service industry, bigger often just means slower. When a clinic in Detroit had an X-ray machine break down, the local manager used to call a repair guy and pay him out of the register. It was fixed in 4 hours. Under Vanguard, they had to submit a ticket to the Central Procurement Office in New Jersey. They had to get 3 quotes. They had to wait for approval. The machine stayed broken for 3 weeks. Revenue at that clinic dropped 15% for the month. Multiply that by 140 clinics. Then came the economy. In 2022, inflation spiked. The cost of labor for veterinary technicians surged. To keep staff, Vanguard had to raise wages by 20%. Simultaneously, the Federal Reserve began its war on inflation. Interest rates rose. This was the variable Elias had ignored. The $400 million in debt he had used to buy the clinics was floating rate debt. When he took out the loans, the interest rate was 4%. He was paying $16 million a year in interest. Manageable. As rates climbed, his interest payments ballooned. 5%, 7%, 9%. Suddenly, the debt service wasn't $16 million. It was $36 million. The margin of error evaporated. The arbitrage was being eaten alive by the cost of capital. Elias needed to grow his way out of the problem. He needed more clinics to dilute the overhead. But he couldn't borrow more money. The banks were tightening up. He made a decision that marks the transition from ambitious strategist to desperate gambler. He called an emergency meeting with his operational VPs. "We need to unlock value inside the existing portfolio," Elias said, pointing to a graph that showed stagnant revenue per patient. "We are leaving money on the table. We need to implement the gold standard protocol across all sites." Immediately. The gold standard protocol was corporate speak for aggressive monetization. It mandated that every pet, regardless of age or symptom, be recommended a full blood panel. It mandated a price hike on all emergency services. "It's better medicine," Elias argued, convincing himself. "It catches diseases early." "It's gouging," one of the regional directors whispered. "It's mandatory," Elias said, "or we miss our covenants." The breaking point didn't happen in the boardroom. It happened in the lobby of the Vanguard Clinic in Des Moines, Iowa. A local news station ran a segment. A grandmother living on a fixed income had brought in her cat for a minor infection. She left with a bill for $1,200. She had been talked into credit financing she couldn't afford by a front desk receptionist who was terrified of missing her weekly conversion quota. The story went viral locally. Then it hit Reddit. Then the whistleblowers came out. Former employees began posting screenshots of internal Vanguard memos. They showed the leaderboards Elias had installed, ranking doctors not by patient outcomes, but by revenue generated per hour. The Wall Street Journal picked up the story. The headline was devastating. The high cost of puppy love. How private equity is squeezing pet owners. But headlines don't kill companies. Cash flow kills companies. The bad PR caused a dip in patient volume, a 10% dip. In a normal business, a 10% drop in revenue is a bad year. In a highly leveraged business, where every dollar is spoken for by the debt, a 10% drop is a death spiral. Elias watched the daily dashboards turn red. He needed cash to pay the bank. He stopped paying vendors. This is the phase of a collapse known as stretching the payables. The pharmaceutical companies, noticing the late payments, put Vanguard on credit hold. Now the clinics couldn't order vaccines, they couldn't order anesthesia. Doctors were canceling surgeries because they didn't have the supplies. Revenue dropped further. It was a feedback loop from hell. Elias was working 20-hour days. He was flying to meet with new investors, trying to secure a bridge loan, emergency capital at predatory rates. He was offering 15% interest. He was offering personal guarantees. He was in denial. He still believed the model was sound. He just needed time. It's a liquidity crunch, not a solvency issue, he repeated to his mirror, to his wife, to his partners. But the market knows the difference. Which brings us back to the conference room at 4:17 a.m. The bank had seen the covenant report. They knew Vanguard couldn't cover its interest payments. When the sun came up, the phone rang. It was the head of workout at Sterling National Bank. "Mr. Thorne," the banker said. His voice wasn't angry. It was clinical. "We are accelerating the debt. You are in default." "I have a term sheet for a bridge loan coming in on Friday," Elias lied. He didn't have a term sheet. He had a vague promise from a distressed debt hedge fund that wanted to strip the company for parts. "We aren't waiting for Friday," the banker said. "We are exercising our step-in rights. We are appointing a chief restructuring officer. You're done, Elias." The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. By noon, the bank had seized the operating accounts. By 2 p.m., Elias's email access was revoked. The fallout was absolute. The equity, the $200 million from the teachers and universities, was wiped out, zeroed. The bank took ownership of the company. Their goal wasn't to run it. It was to salvage their principal. They initiated a fire sale. The 140 clinics were broken up and sold off in bundles to competitors for pennies on the dollar. The brand of Vanguard Pet Health became toxic. The name was scrubbed from the buildings. Elias didn't go to jail. He hadn't broken the law. He hadn't stolen money. He had simply been wrong. But the consequences were severe. His firm, Aurelius Capital, dissolved. No limited partner would ever give him $1 again. He was radioactive. The lawsuits from the minority shareholders dragged on for 3 years. They took his house in the Hamptons. They took the liquid assets. But the hardest part wasn't the money. 6 months after the collapse, Elias took his golden retriever, heavy with arthritis, to a vet clinic near his rental home in Connecticut. He didn't recognize the name on the sign. He sat in the waiting room, just another customer. He watched the receptionist juggling 3 phones, looking exhausted. He watched a young doctor come out, eyes red-rimmed, clearly burnt out, apologizing to a client for the wait. Elias looked at the intake form on the clipboard. At the very bottom, in small print, he saw a familiar copyright notice, a remnant of the software system he had installed. He realized then that he hadn't just lost money. He had broken things. He had taken a functioning ecosystem of care and trust, and he had fed it into a machine that was designed to extract value that didn't exist. He had tried to optimize a heartbeat. There's a seduction in the world of high finance that suggests everything can be quantified, that with enough leverage and the right spreadsheet, you can bend reality to your will. Elias Thorne was a man of high intelligence and low wisdom. He understood the mechanics of debt, but he failed to understand the physics of human systems. He forgot that in business, as in physics, friction generates heat. If you push a system too hard, if you strip away the slack in the name of efficiency, you don't create a perfect machine. You create a bomb. The tragedy of Vanguard Health wasn't that the strategy was illegal. It was that it was logical. It was the cold, unfeeling logic of capital divorced from consequence. Elias Thorne walked out of that clinic with his dog, into the gray light of a winter afternoon. He was free of the debt. He was free of the stress. But he carried with him the heavy, silent knowledge that some things in this world cannot be leveraged. They can only be lost.